Our next speaker is Kwamena Quagrainie from Purdue University. He's going to speak about public perceptions and attitudes toward aquaculture.
Some of the stuff I'm going to talk about have already been reiterated earlier. We all know what the public perceptions are, what these perceptions are. So I'll take you through some issues in terms of messaging. That's where probably I'll put much of my emphasis. So the outline, what are the issues which you've heard quite a bit about? What does the research say about perceptions? And then the messaging, how is the message being received by the public? And then how can we change perceptions? And we will talk about that and see. So we see that the area of concern varies with different public. NGOs, other environmental organizations, their main concern is about the practice of aquaculture. You have those whose main concern is more about the production practice. And then you have those, their main concern is the product coming out of aquaculture. So each of these groups and their concerns, they are all giving out some information either about the practice, about the production method, about the product. And that is what is really out there. Each one is taking a piece of this and then running with it. And we're all familiar with what they talk about, all the negative stuff about it. And then there are other things they say about the products. These are the things they associate with the product coming out of aquaculture, and we're all familiar with it. So I have this quote from a German philosopher who says, all things are subject to interpretation. Whichever interpretation prevails at a given time is a function of power, not the truth. And we've heard that from the earlier talks. So whoever has the power to get the information out there, that is what is really being interpreted. So what is happening to the public? They are confused. And John Hargreaves really put it well in the editorial of World Aquaculture, and many of you read that the media have embraced negative narratives about aquaculture, and these have sown confusion in the minds of consumers, and people are really hesitant about whether they have to buy fish generally. And so these skewed perspectives is very common among American consumers. So there's this study that came, before that. This is a study that came out of Harvard. Some of them are from the medical school, some of them are from the public health, and I think one of the authors is also from the Department of Environment. So the paper, the title, Which Fish Should I Eat? That was what they were trying to respond to. So they look at the scientific literature on public health and guidelines, advisories, and all that. And then they separated the information into toxicological, nutritional, ecological, and economic importance. How all these different messages were getting through to the public. And these are their main conclusions, that most of the guidance is focusing on the toxicological and the nutritional aspect, but the ecological and the economic perspective really is not being highlighted. And I think it was John's presentation that mentioned that consumers are particular about price and not the other stuff. I think it was John, your presentation, that mentioned that. So the economic perspective probably is not getting a lot of attention. And then they also said that there should be a better communication integrating all these issues, because they think that multiple impacts will rather help to change perceptions instead of these isolated issues that is being presented to the public. And then they also said excuse me, they also concluded that we should have very clear and simple guidance because there are so many messages out there and consumers are really getting confused. This is a study that I was referring to that Kim mentioned earlier in her presentation. And this is out of University of California, Santa Barbara. So they look at both developed countries and developing countries, looking at newspaper headlines. And generally, they say that overall, there's a positive trend, but it's more so in developing countries than in developed countries. And in the US, most of the comments or the negative comments, which is influencing aquaculture, was mainly from local environmental disasters. That is really driving the negative concerns. And their main conclusions are that there should be informed discussions about some of the positive aspects in terms of people understanding the various types of aquaculture production practices, and then also bringing up some of the economic development aspects of aquaculture, because that is missing in the conversation. And they also emphasize that there should be better communication. It looks like the communication we need to do a lot more, because there's so much perceptions out there which is contrary to what the real issues are regarding aquaculture. And the last point is what Jim also mentioned, that it looks like the environmental groups are driving the conversation, and we don't have a lot of stakeholders, bringing out the positive aspects of aquaculture. And then a third study that I want to highlight here, this just came out from Haro is in Rhode Island. Kathy is head of department Agicon at University of Idaho. And they look at this study looking at how do consumers react to these cards that are out there. And you agree with me that there are so many of them out there. There's this one from EPA and FDA giving some guidance about what kinds of seafood you should eat. There's one, the one down left is from the Academy of Sciences, giving you which ones are safe to eat, targeting some particular demographics. The one on the right is from my university. Those who know Charlie Sentier, he's been a food scientist. He's done a lot on contaminants, and that's his card. So what these guys did was to look at these cards and see how do consumers react to the information they are getting from these cards. So the observation is that the seafood industry places more emphasis on the health benefits of seafood. The government, FDA and EPA, they focus more on the risk coming from mercury and other contaminants. The one from Charlie Sentier identifies the best and the worst seafood choices based on omega-3 and mercury content. And then the one from National Academy of Sciences, they just put the information out there and you have to decide for yourself what you want to do. And their main conclusion is that these findings are not improving the consumer's ability to really sift through the information is getting in terms of the risk and the benefits of consuming seafood. So it all feeds into this confusion that is out there. So the main issues are that the confusion is because of mixed messages. There are so much misinformation and different kinds of information that is being thrown at the consumer. So it's really a mixed message. And like we've heard before, the media seems to be dominating the conversation when it comes to aquaculture. And then aside of that, we have the food consumption advisories. We have from NGOs, we have from state governments. Almost every state has some fish consumption advisories going on. And the scientific literature also have their findings, like I showed you, all giving out some information. At the end of the day, if you look at all these, the underlying issues relating to consuming seafood is either you eat to maximize your health, or you are minimizing your illness, or you are minimizing the impact on the environment. So that is sort of the underlying message in each of these that is being thrown out there. What about public policy? We have USDA involved in some aspect of it, NOAA involved in some aspect of it. When it comes to seafood inspection, FDA is involved in aspects, USDA is involved in certain aspects. And then when it comes to regulating aquaculture, there are several agencies also involved in different things. So what I think is that part of the misunderstanding and the confusion out there, it's not only on the consumer side, even when it comes to the oversight and how people will understand aquaculture and really even get into investing in aquaculture. There are many potential investors out there who are really not clear in their minds what aquaculture is all about. So it's not only on the consumer side. I will argue that even on the investment side, there's no clarity in terms of an investor understanding what aquaculture entails and getting into it. And Ladan mentioned, some of this about the public support for aquaculture, and many of you probably have seen the study by Love that he presented in San Antonio and recently came out in the WAS Journal. So he looked at 1990 to 2015, and his conclusion is that out of the billion, there's about 37 return on investment. And 1990 to 2015, 1 billion, is it enough to have grown the industry? I don't know, but like Ladan was saying, it's more money necessary translate into more growth in the industry. That is something we could talk about. And then regulations. We are all aware of the various regulations relating to aquaculture, and Carol and Jonathan's study and some of the numbers they put out. Offshore aquaculture, we know the discussion that has been going on for years. Organic aquaculture, we know the discussion that has been going on over the years. And if you talk to George, I think he can take the whole day to talk about organic aquaculture with you. So there are all these issues which I think is also affecting policy, because there's really some confusion and no clarity. So it's not only on the consumer side, I would say general public, whether it's a consumer or an investor or something, there are so many things, even with the policymakers, excuse me to put it that way. So whose voice is being heard? I think the issue is messaging, and Kim mentioned that earlier in her talk. So the content of the message, how should we go about it? There are some things that probably, I put it up here, that the messaging should leverage the values of the society. And we know some of those things. Safety, health issues. So any information about aquaculture, any information about products that we are putting out there, in terms of the messaging of that, should sort of leverage whatever values we think our consumers are involved in. Consumers may accept information which aligns with their existing attitudes and beliefs. That way we are leveraging, the message. Or they may reject as inaccurate information which conflicts with their preconception. So if they have some preconceptions about aquaculture, or about aquaculture products. How am I doing with time?
I was just scratching.
Okay. So if they have some preconceptions, no matter what we throw at them, they may not, take it. So we really need to understand because all our meetings, all our discussions at the end of the day is to how to increase demand for aquaculture products. And we need to understand the consumer. How do they respond and utilize the information that they are getting? And they react to the information in different way. Health benefit versus risk avoidance. And let me throw this, two statements to you. They are basically the same thing, but written in a different way. Eating fish high in omega-3 could help reduce your risk of heart attack by as much as 30%. Let's put it the other way. Failure to consume fish high in omega-3 could increase your risk of heart attack by as much as 30%. Which of these statements really catches your attention? The failure part. So, and it comes back to the point, the messaging, how we put the message across, because consumers, like I said earlier, they respond differently and utilize the information differently from the way they receive it. So, again, let's look at demographics. The same two statements, how would older people take the information compared to younger people? So does it mean when it comes to the message, should we have a uniform message for all consumers, or people take the information differently? Those are some things that I think we need to think about. And where do they place much emphasis? Is this on the human aspect, the society aspect, or the environment? And those are the things that we should think about. So I have some principles here when you look at the literature on the economics of information. There are some principles that should guide us when it comes to trying to get our message across to the public. Information, whatever its content, may be ineffective and can potentially heighten rather than quell consumer concerns. That is something we have to keep in mind. For uninformed consumers, new information heighten awareness, but will not necessarily reduce the level of concern. So those are the things we need to keep in mind. Better informed consumers tend to be more accepting when presented with short factual statements. Probably we need to pick on that when we are talking about aquaculture. Information on history can allay some consumer fears, because if you talk about history, it demonstrates acceptance within the society and the test of time. So that is telling our stories. And the success, the talk that we had before the break about the success of the trout industry, those are some of the things we need to get out. So let's ask ourselves certain questions. What needs to change with the consumer to enable increased demand? That is something we need to think about. What are consumers really thinking about aquaculture? Where is the confusion on the part of the consumer? What are the beliefs or perceptions, wrong as they may be, that we really need to clarify with the consumers? And how have we communicated clearly enough or simple enough to them? So these are some things that I think we need to ask ourselves. So with that, how can we change public perceptions? Some ideas here: probably develop innovative ways, to get our information across to public. Maybe we need to look at the whole seafood value chain and address issues relating to that. And I think in one of the earlier talks, it was we need to be careful not to try to separate wild fisheries from aquaculture, but seafood as seafood. In that case, if we capture any issues relating to the seafood value chain, probably we can make some inroads with the consumers. Self-regulation of the industry, if the consumer knows that we are really doing the best, and we are doing, but probably the message is not getting across very well. And then the government has a role also to help get the message out across. So we have to be strategic in how we get out our message to shape perceptions. Do we have to coordinate our messaging? Do we have to cooperate at the national level, local levels? How can government and NGOs, collaborate in terms of messaging? And the last point here, it looks like different groups purport to speak for the aquaculture industry. Some probably not aligned with or related with aquaculture in any way, and yet they seem to have a voice speaking for aquaculture industry. So those are some things that we need to look at. Generic versus specific species information, should we emphasize more on our various species, or we should look at it in general? And here, the second point, we should avoid painting a broad brush, of whatever it is about seafood, because it affects us all. And that is something we should keep in mind. And then striking a balance in terms of the advisories from the federal level, from the state level, and some of the dietary guidelines, and then addressing imports versus domestic issues. So those are my thoughts, and I will open it up. We have time for questions, right?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you know the reference to one study looking about perceptions in offshore aquaculture, aquaculture in general? Do you know if there was a breakdown by region, like versus people who live on the coast versus inland versus south, north, west?
Which of the studies?
I thought there was one. Wasn't there about perceptions of offshore?
There was a spatiotemporal one from UC Santa Barbara.
Oh, the one from Santa Barbara.
Do you know if did they break it down on a regional?
Well, I was caught up on that, and we did not break it down regionally, other than to look at New Zealand versus the United States,
Okay.
and to look at a specific event, a specific like a permanent issue versus a general policy. The policies were generally more favorable. The specific actions were generally less favorable, but we didn't take the granularity.
Can I just make a quick comment? There was a study done by a graduate student several years ago from the University of Idaho, Public Perception. I can't remember her name now. I think it was published in World Aquaculture Society. And they did a little bit of regional, and not surprisingly, people living in Seattle and around Seattle area had a very negative perception of aquaculture.
Shannon Amber.
Thank you. I
Yeah.
couldn't remember her name. Thank you.
There was also one done between Hawaii and Kentucky
Oh, yeah.
many years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. Bauer.
Looking at your, you had that nice example of how to rephrase the suggestion and you used the, whether you were using the higher level of omega-3 fatty acids. And I think that's also, but I would even take that and tweak it one little bit more. We have a problem where if you're not careful about how you talk about omega-3 fatty acids, you start separating out the species.
Okay.
Right now, there's a lot of doctors out there who will say, they're telling their patients, eat salmon, do not eat catfish. Do not eat some of these other freshwater fish because they don't have omega-3 fatty acids. But if you go then to the USDA nutrition site, you will see that catfish has more omega-3 fatty acids than chicken. But these same doctors will tell their patients, oh, you eat chicken 3 days a week, I'll let you eat beef once, as long as you get your salmon in, but don't eat catfish. And I had some interesting discussions with a nurse who is starting to change diets and things with his family. He's experimenting on his kids. And no, not me. I'm not a nurse. And so anyway, he, I said to him, I said, look, why wouldn't you drop out some of that chicken and replace it with catfish? Less fat, more omega-3 fatty acids. And he looked at me like I was crazy. And his wife came back to me about a week later and he says, he went and started researching. He says he thinks you might have an idea. So we still have this incredible perception.
Yeah,
thing,
yeah.
And the medical community is not helping us.
Yeah.
And I think we just have to be real careful about how we package our
Yeah.
message, as you said.
Yeah, you are right.
Isn't that sort of ultimately that all these questions will come down to the fact that not as well liked by Americans as other meats? It wouldn't be an issue if people, you have to convince people to eat fish because it's good. Tastes great. It's still like, that's the problem is that, I guess, you wouldn't even consider having this issue that when if people are saying, we're going to be running out of chicken soon, we're going to be running out of pork. But I guess it seems like a lot of Americans are just ambivalent to the fish problem because they don't like it so much. Fish tastes good. I don't understand why it's such a problem.
No, I think we can influence, consumer perceptions. It's just that the negativity is just too much, outweighing the positives. That's the way I say it. Yes, Jim.
It seems like with sport fishing consumer advisories, we've set ourselves up to be worrying about contaminants in fish. Now we talk about you shouldn't eat fish from this place. It'll elevate your risk of cancer. What 2 in 10,000, not 30% elevation of your risk of heart attack. But we don't have that relative. See the consumer advisories and decide that fish are generally contaminated.
Yeah.
And they hear about PCBs and salmon that are aquaculture done. And one situation suddenly makes the whole industry the same way. It seems just like we've set ourselves up to fail by these by the public advisories that we put out.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah, sure.
So, Jeff Henshaw and I did a study for U.S. trout farmers a long time ago when mercury was coming to the forefront, and we found out that U.S. farm-raised trout, rainbow trout, mercury content was like 0.014 parts per million, extremely low. Well, how do you communicate that to a consumer? Because one, what's a part per million? How do you conceptualize that? And the consumer's going to think, whoa, mercury, there should be 0 mercury. So we went back and looked at the EPA reference dose for mercury, and then made up an imaginary 140-pound pregnant woman, and said that she could eat a pound a day of U.S. farm-raised trout for her entire lifetime and never exceed EPA's reference dose on mercury. And so when you put it in pound a day, I mean, hell, they're only eating 15 and a half. Pregnant women are only eating, 2.5 ounces a week. So if that, maybe they didn't change it, but at least they could relate to, what the risk was, because they could eat up to a pound. So kind of did that way.
Yes, Sam.
Kwamena, excellent presentation. One thought and one suggestion. Thought is, how do we get into this treadmill with this messaging regarding consumption advisories into this situation? Because I looked at those rat cards, basically, that you see, and I know that many of my extension colleagues, including myself, we share those, and yet they're in some ways it highlights fish in aquaculture. So that's one question. The other part is, you all know CVAT right now has this call about visioning for resilience, and perhaps this topic of consistent messaging could be that visioning could be one of those topics.
Yes. And I think probably some states are doing it better than others in terms of collaboration, because each state is different. If I take Illinois, for example, they are not as friendly to aquaculture as Indiana. I'm taking Illinois, Indiana as an example. So if the states can really collaborate well, some of these messaging can be consistent and not contradictory. I think that's where the problem is. Some do a better job, whilst others, everybody is on its own trying to push things. And a typical example, I think Chris will bear to that, even in sea grants, Sea Grant website or some aspect where we have invasive species, and aquaculture is blamed for invasive species. The same program, different messages. So those are, if we can really coordinate, collaborate well, understand each other, and then have a consistent message, I think it will help, you know, with the consumer or with the public in general about seafood and aquaculture.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
We're going to have lunch. We're going to have break.